So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. Now, I was originally asked to talk about the Economic Botany collection at Kew, but given the time of the year and the difficulty in choosing from around about 100,000 specimens of useful plants, it seemed logical to focus on Christmas. And as my rather cheesy introductory slide shows, the plants are a very good shorthand for Christmas, that combination of conifers and holly and mistletoe. As soon as you see it, it says Christmas. But I'm going to draw a few kind of illustrations in my talk from the Economic Botany collection at Kew. Some of you will know they're by far the most interesting collection at Kew, and also from the Linnean Society's vaults, which are somewhere underneath our feet. Now, of course, the question that one faces is which plants to talk about. Now, last year, we had an excellent talk on the Christmas food by Angela Dixon, a Kew volunteer, on the botanical ingredients of a Christmas pudding. And you can see that on the Linnean Society's Vimeo channel. And there's also an excellent Kew blog post by my colleague Mike Fay on the botany of the Christmas pudding. So I decided to steer away from food and instead to look at plants whose importance at Christmas is really symbolic or spiritual. So aspects of plants that are often neglected by kind of professional ethnobotany. And there are reasons for that. It can be very challenging to get at the meanings of plants and to understand their history. And there's also a complicated history of a kind of mythology of a mythology building up. And we'll do a little bit of myth busting today in this talk, when we look at how Christmas and its links with these plants has evolved. So I've chosen 5 plants and fungi to talk about. Frankincense and myrrh, mistletoe, fly agaric, might not seem like a Christmas fungus, but we'll come to that. The Christmas tree and the poinsettia. So starting with frankincense and myrrh, this is, I think, the only Christmas plant or pair of plants that has a truly ancient history, thanks to the Gospel of Matthew, which says, and when they, the wise men, not in fact numbered in the Gospel, were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary, his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And when they had opened their treasures, they presented him with gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, which you can see in this lovely painting by Giorgione in the National Gallery just around the corner from here. With the gifts, I think one's already been handed over, and 2 more are to come. And there's a long history of frankincense and myrrh in ancient offerings in the classical period. There's probably a strong symbolic aspect to that trilogy, gold representing his kingship, frankincense, a symbol of a priestly role, and myrrh, a prefiguring of his death and embalming as a disinfecting and aromatic material. So both frankincense and myrrh come from a number of species growing in southern Arabia, Yemen and Oman, for example, and the Horn of Africa, for example, Ethiopia, Eritrea and Somalia. Now, these are not the easiest places to travel, even in the past, but especially now. And there's been a huge amount of confusion because of the presence of a number of very similar species. A lot of this has been unraveled by botanists at Kew, in particular late Nigel Hepper, and by Kai Bollesen. And recent work by ecologists at Wageningen University has looked wider. This is a really large-scale trade. The main importance now of frankincense and myrrh is aromatic materials to be burnt on incense burners, which you can see some just on the shelf up here, these very characteristic sort of clay vessels for burning incense. Also medicinal uses. It's a very large-scale trade, and it's increasing as people have better access to markets, as interest in these products in Chinese medicine, for example, increases as people become richer. So the sustainability of these trees is a real issue for botanists, and recent work by ecologists at Wageningen University in the Netherlands has shown that frankincense trees, non-tapped trees, produce 3 times as many healthy and filled seeds as tapped trees. So it's a rather indirect thing. The tapping is not in itself killing or damaging the trees, but it is reducing the energy that the trees can put into their seeds. And it's regeneration of forests. This is very often the case with trees, but it's not always damage to trees. It's the regeneration. It's the seedlings that are being affected by poor seed set, by diseases, by overgrazing. And the frankincense and myrrh represent a very sort of typical challenge in that uses of plants are a very good thing, are very good for sustainable livelihoods, and particularly in the very arid areas where these trees grow, these really bring a very substantial cash injection in. Use often leads to conservation. People protect plants that they use, but overuse, particularly in the context of globalization, then often leads to more damaging situation. One of the things that we know from the experience with trees, which was now a fairly good certification process in place, and medicinal plants, so we're just starting this process of certification and really certifying sustainability, is that traceability, tracking back raw materials where they came from, is absolutely key to conservation and to making sure that money gets back to the communities that actually harvest these plants. And this is a real challenge in this area. Come back to that in a second. I should say that both of these exudates, both are a mixture of a resin that's not soluble in water and a gum that is soluble in water, very rich in essential oils. Essential oils are typically antimicrobial, have a whole range of medicinal uses. So it's not surprising there are a lot of medicinal uses associated with these plants. But we shouldn't be too complacent in assuming that we kind of know the story of frankincense and myrrh in the ancient world. It's long been thought that some very common terms in ancient Egyptian texts, sunter, might refer to frankincense. But a series of really pioneering analyses that started in the 1990s, again at the National Gallery, just around the corner, in the analytical laboratories, established that a lot of what had been identified previously as frankincense or myrrh remains from the ancient world are in fact of mastic. This comes from different pistachio or terebinth species. Today we're most familiar with mastic production from Chios in the Aegean, but it's previously produced all over the Mediterranean. And the real kind of game changer, the thing that changed people's minds about this, was the discovery of the Uluburun shipwreck. And here you see the contents of this late Bronze Age shipwreck, it's about 1400 BC, 1300 BC, arranged in the museum at Bodrum. And there are around about 120 of these Canaanite amphorae. So the Canaanites, so they come from Palestine, from the Levant. Each of these contained, and still contains today, around about 9 kilograms of resin. And it was this resin which was identified conclusively by multiple analytical chemists as mastic, as coming from the terebinth tree, that suggested that there might be large-scale trade in this product going on. And it looks like the boat, which sank off the southern coast of Turkey here, was following an anti-clockwise route, picking up resin here, picking up other products in Turkey, and then delivering down into Egypt down here. And the subsequent analyses have shown that most of the ancient resins found in Egypt are in fact of pistachio, or terebinth resin. And its reach is much wider than that. Recent papers just come out, which finds that frankincense, mastic, and pine resin are very common in late Roman burials in Britain. If you look for traces of the preserving materials, mastic's turning up, they're far away from the Mediterranean, and quite distant in time from this as well. So there's a third, alongside frankincense and myrrh, there's a third, very similar looking material, very similar properties in circulation in the ancient world. There's still something to unpick there. So moving on to mistletoe, you'll all be familiar with mistletoe, of course. You can see here Linnaeus' own specimen from the herbarium here, and an illustration from a book on medicinal plants, so we'll come back to that in a moment. So it's parasitic, particularly of apple trees, as you'll know, but also blackthorn, hawthorn, lime, poplar, and willow. So because it's parasitic, it doesn't rely on photosynthesis, it's therefore evergreen, and therefore it has this very strong association with winter as a plant that's green in winter. And in Britain, the border towns between England and Wales are traditionally the centre for the wild mistletoe trade. Attempts at cultivating mistletoe, which were pioneered at Kew a few years ago, I think still very much in infancy, so it's very much a wild product. And the auctioneers, Brightwells and Tenbury Wells, sell around about 5 tonnes a year through auctions. But in practice, what you buy in London is almost certainly going to be cheaper imports of mistletoe from France, where, as you've probably seen on your travels, it grows very abundantly. Now, in contrast to frankincense and myrrh, mistletoe has a history that really fades away on close examination. The earliest evidence for the association of Christmas in Britain, or really in Europe, is the 18th century. And it's in the 19th century that it becomes well established as the subject of terribly unfunny cartoons and punts. There's about 50 in the Punch archive about mistletoe, and that's about the most amusing of them. Oh, don't you like Christmas time, Mr. Brown, and all its dear old customs? Brown doesn't seem to see it. And she's hovering under the mistletoe. There is a whole kind of subculture, if you like, on the internet based around the antiquity of mistletoe and its use in Druidic practices. And this is a really difficult area to investigate, but that all really rests on one reference in the works of Pliny, the author, which refers very specifically to mistletoe gathering by Druids in Gaul, and to a very particular instance of mistletoe occurring on oak, which is where it grows very rarely, rather than on sort of routine collecting of mistletoe for cultic purposes. So really the history of mistletoe as a Christmas plant is a relatively recent one. There's a much deeper history of medicinal use, and you see that here in some chopped up twigs from the Economic Botany collection at Kew. There's a strong tradition of a traditional use by herbalists in Britain and in Europe for epilepsy. It has the effect of depressing the nervous system and repressing fits. But today, mistletoe leaves and twigs are widely used as an alternative cancer treatment in Central Europe. It's a business worth some tens of billions of pounds. It's very difficult with herbal medicines to get a sense of whether they work or not, and this is a very typical case, but there's a range of clinical trials. The ones that are well managed tend not to show effectiveness, and the ones that are not so well managed tend to show effectiveness. There seems to be a consensus that there are sufficient hints of effectiveness, but its properties are well worth further investigation. So I just wanted to pause there for a moment to talk about this association of Christmas and winter. It's something I hadn't really realized before I started reading for this talk. But it's a very complicated story. I think best investigated by a historian, Ronald Hutton, a 17th century historian with a strong interest in folklore, who spent literally decades reading all the primary sources for British folklore. And the author of Stations of the Sun, a really fascinating book about the ritual calendar in Britain. And he points out there's nothing in the Bible to indicate what season Christ was born. The date of the 25th of December first appears really quite a lot later, 354 AD, so 350 years later in Rome. And with that date chosen to replace the Emperor Aurelian's Sun Festival, in itself also quite recent in origin, 274 AD. And if you set aside those quite late cases, and you look at in general, the record for when did ancient celebrations take place, there is very clearly a pretty much worldwide pattern in temperate eras. But that period of the shortest nights starting to lengthen again is very widely celebrated by the Calendai festival in Rome, for example. But trying to pin that down to the solstice, as many people would like to do, is almost impossible. And when you take Christmas out of the occasion, it has occasionally been suppressed, as in 17th century Scotland, for example, to the fact New Year but rises up as the major festival, the 31st of December to the 1st of January. That's quite a common pattern in the past as well. So we need to be a little bit cautious. Christmas maps very well onto a long-established pattern of a turn-of-the-year festival. It doesn't map quite so well onto a solstice festival. So, fly agaric, how has this crept into a talk? And this, I think, popped up actually on the radio the other day. One or two maybe heard this story. It's a great story. Like a lot of these great stories, I think, melts away a little bit on closer examination. But it's a great book by Roger Highfield, Can Reindeer Fly? Or The Science of Christmas, which he explains this story. Fly agaric is first described. This is a specimen in the Kew collection. By Linnaeus, in fact, whose honour the society is named, the Swedish botanist, the father of modern taxonomy, in 1753 as Agaricus muscarius. And muscarius, that refers to the Latin musca, or fly. So it's used in parts of Europe as an insecticide, crushes the mushroom in milk, and it attracts and kills flies. And as that suggests, but this is in fact a poisonous mushroom. It's psychoactive, it's hallucinogenic, contains some alkaloids, ibotenic acid, muscazone, and these react with neurotransmitter receptors in the central nervous system and lead to both psychoactive activity and to poisoning, where deaths are extremely rare or possibly never occur. But it's rather a fascinating fungus in that the toxins are water-soluble. And in most mycophilic countries, and of course Britain is a highly mycophobic country, in mycophilic countries the mushrooms are steeped in lots of water or in vinegar or in both, and then eaten and much appreciated. I should say on our website, Kew doesn't recommend you eat any fungi in this particular genus, but nonetheless it is widely eaten in Europe. But if it's eaten dry, that psychoactive ibotenic acid turns into muscimol, which is 10 times more potent, and has quite a long tradition of being used by shamans in both Lapland and Siberia. So the connection of Christmas hinges on a number of things. The similarity of the red and white costume of Santa Claus, that of the colours represented on the mushroom, to what is, I think, a well-established practice worldwide amongst shamans. When you take a psychoactive plant, the reason that you take it is in order to fly into the spirit world and to ask them to intercede on people's behalf. So there's then comes an association about flying, Lapland, Siberia, an association about reindeer, which then comes together into a package about Santa Claus, reindeer, and sleigh. But I think the weakness of this theory really lies in the evolution of the modern Santa as represented in this Coca-Cola advertisement, as that suggests very much a North American phenomenon, and rather a well-documented one because of his use in advertising and poetry and other sources, whereas the shamans and the mushrooms are in pretty remote parts of the world in Lapland and Finland. But it is curious how prevalent the fly agaric is in kind of greetings cards, representations of the woods. And a popular design today for contemporary Christmas decorations, particularly in Scandinavia. So there's an interesting link there. Moving on to Christmas trees, and here we are moving on to much firmer history, at least in the UK, but the initial Christmas trees seem to have been brought into Britain by the Hanoverian royal family, coming from Germany, perhaps even into Kew Palace itself. But the moment that's already crystallized this was the marriage of Queen Victoria to Prince Albert in 1840, and regular use of Christmas trees at Windsor Castle, as you see here, and then that representation in mass media like the Illustrated London News or Punch, that simply didn't exist before the mid-19th century. And there's a very clear pattern of a pick-up by people like Dickens and their novels, and the Christmas tree spreads as that sort of very domestic symbol. There is an earlier history of the Christmas tree, of which we can also be quite certain. That's the bringing inside into the home of conifers, of course the only trees of leaves at Christmas, in Alsace between France and Germany. And here there's good evidence of a tree in Strasbourg Cathedral in 1539, and a tree in a Bremen Guildhall a little bit later, but also in the 16th century, decorated with apples, nuts, pretzels, and paper flowers. And we can see here an 18th century Zurich street corner, 1748, selling little Christmas trees with stands. And we can see a rather fanciful representation of Luther, I think not having a very good Christmas. But Christmas trees are probably not in use in Luther's time, but he was very well disposed, very interested in Christmas, unlike some of his successors. And there is a kind of mythology in Germany about Luther and the Christmas tree. But we can certainly point to 16th century origins in Alsace. But the waters are really muddled when we try to link these quite late appearing, geographically very restricted Christmas trees, but gradually spread. They start in Northern Europe, but not popular for Catholics in southern Germany, but gradually they get picked up there. They spread west and east. It's very difficult to then connect that to the so-called Tree of Life, the Yggdrasil that appears in the Norse epic of Ida in the 13th century. And so here we've got a 17th century Icelandic manuscript of such a tree, and here we've got a sort of folkloristic 19th century representation of the Tree of Life. And you end up cherry picking, you end up looking at all representations of art from the past for trees and then saying these are the Tree of Life and this is the origin of the Christmas tree. But there are very significant discontinuities. Now today, Christmas trees, here are the different types, are a very big business. We have a Norway spruce. This is a traditional Christmas tree, the one that I remember in my childhood used to drop its leaves. It's the one that the Norwegians sent to Trafalgar Square, again, just around the corner. And rapidly being replaced by the Nordmann fir here, my favorite Christmas tree. It doesn't drop its leaves and is also more compact with a smaller modern home. And it's a big business. About 6.5 million Christmas trees are grown in the UK, and further 1 million are imported from Denmark. I don't know where. Travelled in Denmark, I haven't seen the Christmas tree plantations. And it's expected, and I'm only going to mention Brexit once, but Brexit will make homegrown trees more attractive because imported trees are going to become more expensive. And so a lot of farmers are looking at ways of diversifying and increasing their income. So I think you expect to see more of these, usually quite small, quite well-managed Christmas tree plantations dotted around the countryside. And just a word about that Nordmann fir. So of these Christmas trees that are commonly grown in the UK, there's only one native one, the Scots pine. Not much favoured. It doesn't drop its leaves, but it has a more shrubby, wider form that makes it not so suitable for modern homes. So otherwise, these have all been introduced from elsewhere. The Nordmann fir is a native of the Caucasus and Asia Minor, discovered in 1836 and first distributed in Britain through Edinburgh a few years later. I'm going to end now with poinsettia, which we might call a millennial. It's a recent addition to this Christmas roster of plants. And today it's a favourite Christmas plant because of the red bracts. You can see here, Marks and Spencer's specimen, a snip at £25, I think, seems stiff to me. And those, of course, are not the actual flowers, they're simply the bracts that surround the flowers. Inside are tiny petalless female flowers surrounded by quite small and inconspicuous male flowers. And it's I think for many of us, the ultimate disposable plant. It's never quite as red in the following years. It's native, in fact, to southern Mexico, where it grows to a pretty large tree, to 4 meters or so in height. And the story of how it traveled from being that wild tree in Mexico to being a Christmas pot plant, part of an industry worth $250 million or so in the United States, probably twice that in Europe. It's a big industry. It's a typically complicated story of plant introduction. You'll find similar complexities behind many sort of economic plants. So poinsettia is in fact a euphorbia species. The species name Pulcherema means very beautiful, which it is. And its common name derives from Joel Poinsett, who's an American diplomat, a minister in Mexico in 1825 to 1830. Not a terribly successful one. I think he would have got on very well with the president-to-be. There's a term in Mexico, poinsetissimo, and it means arrogance and high-handedness. So I'm afraid reflects, of course, a long history of relations in that part of the world. And the story goes that Poinsett observed the plant decorating a nativity scene in Mexico. This is absolutely true, but it is used in some communities to decorate church altars at Christmas, and sent seeds to Philadelphia, where, of course, the Bartram's garden, that's a very long tradition of plant introductions. But repeated efforts by historians have failed to find any contemporary reference to this. And it's most likely that the plant was named, given that popular name, after him, because while he was minister in Mexico, he met and assisted a number of plant collectors at that time. It's highly likely that one of those collected the seeds and took them back to the United States. In any case, by 1830, the plant was starting to circulate in the United States. It was brought by James McNabb to Edinburgh in 1834, and then to Kew, where this rather beautiful illustration in Curtis's Botanical Magazine was prepared. But it's a plant that has spread from Guatemala and southern Mexico. It's naturalized and cultivated in other parts of the world. And Marion North painted it both in Brazil, but also at the Taj Mahal in India. You can see both of those paintings in the Marion North Gallery at Kew. And there's actually a wider symbolic significance to poinsettia. It's grown in India, or the Indian subcontinent, and Nepal, along with marigold, part of that interesting, I think, unexplored Mexican migration of plants. It's used to make an incense, that's used and burnt in offerings to the god Kali, and it's also used in some communities for part of a wedding blessing ceremony. So it has quite a wide history, but of course what we're familiar with is its widespread availability as a Christmas plant. But it has disadvantages as a house plant. As you can see, in the wild it grows too big. And in the wild form, those lovely red bracts drop off after a week or so. This was a constant complaint from people who bought poinsettia in the first half of the 20th century. It looked very nice for a week, and then everything fell off. The breakthrough really came in the 1920s with the discovery of photoperiodism. A poinsettia is a short-day plant. So it means that if you reduce the night length to, if you increase the night length to at least 12 hours or so, you'll start to get the flowering and then the appearance of the bracts. So light control is really important for producing these poinsettias. All of these giant glass houses are equipped so you can run blackout blinds across them. But there were a combination of things were needed, understanding photoperiodism, but also the use of growth regulators, and any poinsettia that you buy will have been treated with a growth regulator to keep it small. Also the use of a phytoplasma, a form of bacteria, which also reduces the branching of the plant. So actually to get that poinsettia into a supermarket and into your home has been quite a complicated technical chain has led to that. So to sum up then, poinsettia is just the latest addition to that roster of Christmas plants. And what you see when you kind of look back a little bit into the past is that we should challenge narratives about some unchanging ancient traditions and actually see something I think that's rather more exciting, which is really twofold. One, that it's great that these plants are still, I don't think we could explain how, but still symbolically extremely important to us, that Christmas wouldn't be the same without them. But secondly, but they are part of an evolving tradition, the invention of tradition, the way that we, all of our belief systems, our medical systems and so on, are constantly changing and evolving through time. And Christmas is just so much a part of that wider pattern as anything else. Thank you.